want to welcome you to the June 10th workshop at Oshkosh Common Council. Our focus tonight is going to be on sex offenders, particularly their placements within the community. We'll talk about some of the issues that go into placement, how that gets done, some of the process. We'll talk about some of the issues with respect to it, and then we can throw around some ideas about concerns that people may have or thoughts that they may have about dealing with it in the future. Turn it over to Mr. Roloff first off.
I'm going to turn it directly over to Chief Groyle.
Chief Groyle.
Well, I just want to say thank you for giving us this opportunity to present information. We've got a lot of information to present tonight. I think probably it will address questions that you might have, clear up some of the myths that are out there. And I just want to take a minute quickly to introduce the experts that are here that are going to be providing the information. First of all, Nicole Hall from the Sex Offender Registration Specialist, Department of Corrections. Todd Tim, who's a field supervisor with the Department of Corrections. And we were having someone from Reach Counseling. I'm not sure she's here. Hopefully she makes it. Mary Kathleen Noe from the, she's a sexual abuse treatment program director with Reach Counseling. And a guest here tonight is State Representative Gordon Hintz, so I appreciate you coming. We did invite Senator Gudix, but he had other arrangements, couldn't make it tonight. So to begin, I want to turn the meeting over to Nicole Hall.
Thank you. I've been told the microphone's up here, so that's where I'm supposed to be. I also want to thank you.
Any of these microphones work. So
do they?
Yep. They're all live.
You good? Okay, maybe it was.
If you want to sit with us at the table, you can sit with us, and then just pull it over a little closer to you there. These are all live. You don't have to push any buttons or anything.
Great, thank you. I also want to thank you for this opportunity. We can't emphasize enough when it comes to managing this population that any decisions that are made are based on evidence and facts and what we know to be true about them, because really only then can the management be effective. So we don't have all the answers, we don't have a crystal ball, but all of us here in this room have been working together for over 20 years with sex offenders the majority of that time. So we think we have quite a bit of experience and knowledge to share with you. Whenever I do a presentation, I always show this slide, so I apologize. If you've seen me before, you've seen this before. And I continue to use it because it really is a very good visual demonstration of what we're talking about when it comes to registered sex offenders. These are all currently registered sex offenders in the state of Wisconsin. Many of them are local to the Oshkosh area. And it's a good reflection that there is no such thing as a typical sex offender. They come from all walks of lives. Our youngest registrant is 13. Our oldest is 98. So when people are thinking about registered sex offenders, they're typically not thinking that big of a spectrum. On the very far end of the continuum, we have very serious offenders who've committed very serious crimes and present a high risk. And at the low end of the spectrum, we have lower level offenders who have less serious crimes and are a much lower risk to reoffend, and we have everything in between. In this photo collage right here, we have two former teachers, a former priest, a former Appleton police officer, and a bunch of other different professions, people who have never held a job, people who have had long-term manufacturing jobs. There really is no such thing as, oh, that person must be a sex offender. You simply can't tell by looking at their outward life or appearance. There are some common threads, though. The first is that sex offenders need secrecy to offend. They are not announcing their intentions. They are not befriending a new family and saying, I'm sexually attracted to your child and I plan to do X, Y, and Z. When I first started in corrections in January of '95, the sex offenders were living anonymously among us. Nobody knew where they were except possibly their agent if they were on supervision and possibly law enforcement. So we've seen a lot of changes in the management of this population over the last 20 years, and I think it's really been beneficial to the community in terms of the amount of information we have access to. Another common thread that we see with sex offenders is that most sex offenders offend based on the need for power and control much more than they do for sex. Just like domestic violence isn't about having a bad temper, rape isn't about sex. It's about power and control and anger. And so I think it's important to keep that perspective when you're thinking about this population. I certainly don't think that you could talk with many offenders that I've worked with over the course of my career who will tell you that I'm easy on sex offenders or sympathetic with them. I've dedicated my career to holding them accountable. But I think that it's important to realize that if power and control is an underlying motive for a lot of the offenses, what happens when offenders are in a situation where no one will rent to them, no one will hire them, their home is being maybe vandalized, their family's being harassed, and what does that do to their sense of power and control and potentially their risk to reoffend? Now, this is a very common myth whenever I talk to a group about sex offenders, and it's important to know the facts about this because if we spend all the time looking in the bushes for the stranger at the park that we think is going to abduct our child, we're going to miss the real risk to kids. Kids are much more at risk from being sexually assaulted, and actually adults are also, by somebody that they already know. Offenders, typically 93% is the statistic we see. 93% of offenders have a relationship with the victim or the family. They engage in a process of building trust and manipulation, and that's how they're accessing victims. So again, if we're basing legislation and management on this stranger danger myth, it's not going to be effective. Another myth is that most sex offenders will reoffend. And I admit, when I came into corrections initially, fresh out of college a long time ago, I thought that this was probably the case also. And what we found is that research consistently shows otherwise. You had a chance to look at the pre-conference materials that you had. There's quite a bit of research in there about the facts about reoffense. And so I'm not going to bore you with a ton of statistics, but essentially, sex offenders are at a surprisingly lower rate to reoffend than what most of us think. They're much lower than other types of offenders like drug offenders, property offenders, other assaultive offenders. And even when we look at reoffense rates, they vary drastically depending on the specific characteristics of the offender and of the offense that they committed. The reason we have a registry, I always think is important to come back to. It really is the roots of what we do and why we're here. And it is one of those awful, probably stranger danger cases that we are all terrified of, whether we're parents or not, because they're just that awful. So in 1989, Jacob Wetterling was 11. He was with two other boys, his brother and a friend, and they were in rural Minnesota, and Jacob was abducted at knife point by a man wearing a mask. He's never been seen since. It remains unsolved. And I had the opportunity to hear his mother speak last fall, and I'll be hearing her speak again at the end of this week. And it's just heart-wrenching to think about what that family went through and goes through on a daily basis. That's a photo of what Jacob might look like today. In that case, in hindsight, law enforcement and the Wetterlings said, what could we have done differently to possibly solve that crime? And one of the things they said is it would have been nice to have a list of the registered sex offenders in the area, to know what they had done, to know where they lived, and maybe to know what kind of vehicle they drove or a physical description. And so essentially that's why we have this law. It was federal legislation that mandated all the states to have some version of a sex offender registry. It's intended to be a tool for law enforcement, first and foremost, in solving crimes. We've had success in the city of Oshkosh by using our registry to identify suspects. That's the first place we go to whenever we have an unsolved crime, maybe a possible enticement. We go to the registry and see what we have for known offenders. And so it is really critical that our registry is accurate, and we always are striving for that. And it is a tool also for victims who really do monitor where their offenders are living and working, and they pay very close attention to that, and it gives them some sense of control and knowing where that person is. And then for the general community, to know who our neighbors are, to know who we're inviting over for a bonfire, to know if we're sending our kids for guitar lessons, to know what that person's history is so we can make informed decisions. We became compliant with the Jacob Wetterling Act in 1997. That's how long we've had a registry. And you can see by this slide, we have over 23,000 registered sex offenders in the state of Wisconsin. That's a large number, but I'm here to tell you that it's actually the good news because we can know who those people are. Their anonymity is gone, their secrecy is gone, we can know where they live, we can know what they did. What worries me, and most of us in this field, are the ones we don't know about, because that's the bulk of the iceberg, and that's what the world of sex offenders is like. So we have certain laws and things we can do with this identified population, but it's really important not to lose the bigger picture that preventative behaviors and education and precautions need to be taken all the time, not just with this population that we know about. I'll break this number down a little bit for you. Of this 23,000 plus, about 5,800 are currently incarcerated, but they're also listed on our registry. So obviously the ones we're going to focus more on are the ones that are in the community. So that's about 5,400 that are on active probation and parole supervision. And Todd Tim is going to talk a little bit about what that entails. But in addition to being listed on our registry, they have a whole host of restrictions that they have to abide by, treatment that they might need to participate in that Mary Catherine can speak about. And in your pre-session handouts, there were also a list of the rules, which if you had a chance to look at, they're pretty extensive. So in addition, they're listed on our registry. And then almost 12,000 of our registry are off of probation and parole supervision. They've served the time imposed on them by the court. And people don't like to hear that, but it is really the basis of our judicial system. You're convicted, you're sentenced, you serve your time, and then that's the only amount of time we can control people and supervise them and place restrictions on them. So that almost 12,000 group still has to register and comply with a few other laws, but essentially they are otherwise free citizens other than those few things that they have to comply with. Now, this is a low number. Actually, there are more than 23,000 sex offenders in the state of Wisconsin, right? Because of this iceberg theory, we know that 1 out of 4 girls and 1 out of 6 boys are sexually assaulted by their 18th birthday. So this is a real problem that we take seriously with this population that we know about, but we can't emphasize enough the importance of prevention education and talking with kids and always practicing safety, even when someone isn't on the sex offender registry. So that's the registry portion of it, which is monitored by the Department of Corrections. Our law, though, gives law enforcement the responsibility of doing active community notification. So that is a local law enforcement decision. We work very closely with our law enforcement on this. We have a core team, a panel of people that come together with various levels of knowledge about the person in the community, and ultimately we usually come to a consensus, I think almost always, but it is ultimately the police department's decision. I will say that locally in Winnebago County, both at the police department, the sheriff's department, and all the surrounding counties, they are very proactive in their notifications. They always err on the side of providing more information, believing that that leads to community safety. Unfortunately, when you do more notifications, sometimes it gives the perception that there are more offenders here, when really it's about we are really trying to share the information with people. So that is really the intent of it. The website also serves as a form of notification all the time. We have a brand new website. It's barely a month old, so I encourage you to check it out. It's the Department of Corrections website, which is the only source of true website information, of registry information. There are other websites out there, familywatchdog.com, homefax.com, and we've even had some of our local media outlets kind of creating their own database and their own maps, and I see those riddled with inaccuracies, unfortunately. So please, if you're trying to really get a sense of the numbers and where people are, our website is the place to find that information. So another myth that we've been dealing with recently is, and really it's not just here, it happens, I cover 3 counties, Calumet, Fond du Lac, and Winnebago counties. I've probably worked with 10 to 12 counties over my time with the registry, and at some point each county feels like they're getting a disproportionate share of registrants. And right now we're hearing a lot is the Department of Corrections is placing all sex offenders in the 54901 zip code, and we're paying crazy amounts of rent to put them there. And that's simply not the truth. First, I want to say that there's been also some media coverage about one of our programs that services approximately 37 offenders on supervised release in our community. And remember, we have over 23,000 total registered sex offenders. We're talking about 37 of our higher risk, intensively supervised sex offenders. And I think it's completely appropriate to question those programs and costs and look at the best, most cost-efficient ways to do that. But I want people to use caution not to generalize that to what we're doing here on a day-to-day basis in Oshkosh and other communities. This applies to a very, very small number of our people. Much more of our registry in the community, in Oshkosh and other communities, are off of supervision. Nobody is approving their residence. Nobody is paying for their residence. They are choosing their residence. And they're choosing it based on the same reasons we all choose our residence. They can afford it. It's available to rent. The landlord's willing to rent to them, or they have family there, or they own the house, or it's near transportation, or they're living with friends. There's a complex socioeconomic factors that are going into this. But please keep in mind that the majority of people are making a choice about where they live, just like the rest of the people who live in those neighborhoods. For those that are on probation and parole supervision, the approximately 5,400, even then, we aren't placing them. By placement, we say you are coming out of prison or you're on probation and we are going to make you live here in this halfway house or in this housing complex. And that's not the case. Offenders propose residence, and the agent does an assessment and looks at their case history and what they've done for treatment and what their risks are, and then either approves or denies it. And I think it's also important to remember that these offenders typically are not coming to their agent with 3 or 4 different options spread across the town, and the agent is choosing one, approving one. They might search for months and months and months and come up with one that the agent might deny. And then they search for months and months and months and maybe come up with another one. Okay, so it's a complex, difficult process, and it is by far probably the hardest part of sex offender supervision. Do you agree with that?
Right. I'm Todd Tim from Probation and Parole, and I can add a little bit to that. It's a very difficult balancing act we have when an offender comes out of prison or they're placed on probation, and they come to us and say, this is where I want to live, this is where I am living and have lived for the last 10 years, but now I've been convicted of this offense, or now I'm coming back out of prison. The vast majority of offenders do have somewhere to go, either with family, friends, or they may have financial ability to rent a place and they've found somewhere. But we do have that number of individuals that have absolutely nothing when they're coming, especially those coming out of prison. They have no money, they have no family, their families have abandoned them, cut all ties with them because of what they've done that sent them to prison, and they have a very difficult time finding a place to reside once they're out. Because once they've served their sentence, they're coming out on a Tuesday, and they're back in our community. The last thing we want is for them to be homeless. We see that in other states where homelessness is a very big problem with the registered sex offenders, and it's caused a multitude of issues for the communities as well as for the agencies who supervise them. So we do our best to assist. There are occasions, and in Oshkosh, and I'll briefly talk about that, and then you can go on. We do have what we call a temporary living placement. The Department of Corrections has contracted with an agency to run an 8-bed facility in town. It's on Jefferson Street. We call it our TLP, Temporary Living Placement. It's a 90-day transitional housing that the department has available to offenders, mostly coming out of prison, who have no other means of finding a place to live. Not all of those offenders are sex offenders. We've capped the maximum number at that facility of 4 for sex offenders. The other 4 can be criminals of any type of crime. And like I said, it's a transitional, it's a 90-day program. There have been 1 or 2 cases where we've kept them a little bit longer than that for a variety of reasons. But our goal is to transition them out, give them an opportunity to get a job, give them an opportunity to find something else if whatever their plans were fell through. So we do have that facility. We also have a 14-bed halfway house called Genesis, which is an AODA mental health dual diagnosis treatment facility. That's down on Otter Street. It's the old Social Security building, I believe. That's been open for about a year now. Again, very rarely do we put any sex offenders there. They need to have alcohol and drug or mental health issues in order to go into that facility. But that is the 2 occasions where we would place someone in the community. There have been occasions where we have money that we've set aside to assist with maybe the first month's rent for an offender. They have a place to stay, but they just don't have enough cash to pay for the rent and security deposit. The department does have some funds, it's very limited, that we can with our higher risk offenders to assist them for the first month rent and maybe security deposit, which they in turn will hopefully pay back. It doesn't happen always, but it does happen on occasion. But that would be the only other time where we would be very active in placing, approving a residence to go.
One question, you referred to zip code 54901. What about 902 and 904? Or do you treat Oshkosh as just zip code 54901? The whole?
No, we treat Oshkosh as Oshkosh. It just, 54901, That's just been an issue. We had a meeting about a year ago with a certain neighborhood who brought up issues about the amount of sex offenders in that zip code as well as their neighborhood. And we went through a lot of those issues, and we will approve residences in anywhere in the city if it's appropriate.
I think that was the issue back a year ago, that there seems to be a large percentage in the 901 zip code, fewer in 902, and almost none in 904. And that was, I think that remains the major issue, is placement in one zip code, which is the older section of town.
And actually, there are quite a few in 54904. It's not the same amount, and I don't have the exact numbers, but it is not. There are still quite a few offenders in 54904. But that's why we say this, is that there's this myth that we are placing offenders in that certain part of town, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Again, most of them are off supervision, choosing their residence, and they're choosing it because of affordability of housing and a variety of other factors.
With respect to community, one of the issues there's the thought, because there's a prison here, Oshkosh is going to get a lot more, also because Oshkosh probably has a lower price housing stock, that Oshkosh is going to tend to get more. When you pick criteria for communities to which they're released into, what are the key criteria? Because at one time I've heard, no, it doesn't come here because we put them back in the community in which they were offended.
The vast majority of
Does Oshkosh?
the vast majority, well over 95%, I would think. Tell me if I'm wrong, but they're from this community.
Right. I don't know
They're
the
going
number,
to prison.
but
They're coming back
that's-
to the community in which they live.
The fact there's a prison here doesn't.
Right.
We don't see that at all.
I did an
Or does that
informal.
feel- things-
Years ago, I did an informal look at that when I was a deputy warden at the Oshkosh prison back in the late 90s. And we had over 2,000 inmates, and we only found 5 families at that point that had moved to the community because of the prison. There's also a myth that people stay at that prison for their entire term, when in fact most inmates at the Oshkosh prison are there for 18 months. And then they're moving on either to release, to a minimum security, whatever it may be. There are the exceptions, obviously, but the vast majority of people coming back or wanting to come to Oshkosh that are sex offenders were living here or committed their crime here.
So-
I'm going to have to ask you to move.
Yep.
We are on a tight time to pages.
Okay, so to give you an idea, every county has registered sex offenders. The larger community, the more people they have. It's very proportionate across the entire state. This is Omro. Even within Omro, you can see that the city, the downtown part of the city, where there's that kind of housing, there are more offenders. This is Oshkosh. This is Fond du Lac, Appleton, Milwaukee. So again, we hear this from every community, and really we just don't see it playing out that this is, we're placing or it's disproportionate. It really is very proportionate, and the dynamic and the makeup of cities.
But do you think that a little bit of that myth is because, like, depending on the level of the sex offender is the notification side of it?
So we're doing more of them,
The
yes.
level ones are the ones that people hear mostly about.
Yes.
But the 2s, 3s, and 4s, you don't hear as much about.
Well, you will have more notifications in the larger city because
Right.
you're drawing from a larger pool of offenders. So if there are 14 offenders in Omro, you're going to have fewer notifications or people
Right.
that rise to that level. And we do save those active notifications for the people we really, want you to pay attention to. Absolutely. I'm just going to summarize this by saying we have such a strong working relationship with our community partners, particularly law enforcement. I cannot speak highly enough to our relationship with the Oshkosh Police Department, from the very top with the chief all the way down to third shift patrol who call my cell phone at 1 in the morning sometimes. So it's a strong relationship that really serves to monitor this population. That communication of them telling us about this contact or us telling them about a certain problem at a house goes a very long way to manage this population. Some communities have taken the approach of adopting ordinances, and I know that there's been some discussion here about that, so I just want to share with you what we know about it. The people in the areas that have those ordinances, I believe, have very noble intentions of protecting their community and their kids. And if I thought for 2 seconds that that was the solution, I would be standing on the table advocating for it right now as loud as I could. Unfortunately, we see that there are a lot of unintended negative consequences with these. We've seen them across the entire country and locally. Iowa passed a state law essentially barring sex offenders from the majority of the places that they could live in the state, they found their noncompliance with the sex offender registry almost instantly doubled. Right now, in Wisconsin, we're about 90 to 95% compliance rate with our registry. So if there's a Jacob Wetterling worst-case scenario here, our registry is going to be a valuable tool for us. It's not going to be in some of these other areas. But more importantly, they're intended to protect communities, right, and reduce reoffense. They found no reduction in their sex crimes. Florida, same thing. They did a study. They found increased transience, homelessness, and clustering of sex offenders, which is linked with reoffense. California, 1/3 of their sex offender parolees are homeless. That's kind of mind-boggling to us because that's not an acceptable standard in Wisconsin. It is very much not the norm that we have a homeless sex offender. And their homelessness was 3 times higher than before they had the restrictions. And the most recent study that's hot off the presses looked at Michigan and Missouri, and again found no impact on recidivism. And they actually came up with a 3% sexual recidivism rate, kind of underscoring what I was saying before about how it is much lower than what people think it is. It's not just us indicating that there might be some problems with these. Iowa County prosecuting attorneys, this task force in Florida. The one that speaks volumes to me are Patty Wetterling, Jacob Wetterling's mother, calls this legislation very misguided. Many police departments, sheriff's departments, and then victim advocacy groups. I mean, people whose job is to advocate for victims and reduce sexual violence in our communities. The national level, the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault, all the way down to your local reach counseling and surrounding areas. In fact, we've had some areas repeal their restrictions. De Pere repealed theirs recently. New Holstein repealed theirs. And we're seeing other Supreme Court rulings come down unfavorable on some of these ordinances and laws. And why is that? It just comes back to that stranger danger myth. It's based on the belief that an offender lives by a park, they're going to be at risk of abducting that child. And in your handouts that you got ahead of time, there are some pretty powerful research that was done on that. Proximity of residence isn't a known risk factor, but offenders that have unstable residence, employment, and family support are at a higher risk to reoffend. Not to mention that they stop registering or they lie about their registry, so it's no longer a valuable tool for law enforcement or the communities. Even if they do move, they still come back to the area to visit their family, their friends, to go to their employment, whatever it was that brought them there in the first place. Every community has to make their own decisions about what's best for them, and I'm certainly not here to tell you what to do with that, but it is so critical to know what you're looking at before you make these decisions, I believe. I've heard of a proposal to create an advisory panel to help disperse the registered sex offenders in the city more evenly. And I just want to share that we've seen similar citizen and council comprised panels, and we're not seeing real positive things from them for a lot of understandable reasons. They don't know the history of the offender. They don't know if the person completed treatment or completely refused treatment. They aren't experts on this very complex area of sex offender management. So we're seeing decisions where sometimes really solid placements are being denied for not very valid reasons, or a very manipulative high-risk offender is coming in and charming them, and then a not appropriate residence is being approved. And so those are the kind of things that we're seeing. Even with our expertise and training, it's a tough decision. So I'm not sure that that's quite the answer people are hoping it would be. And it would be difficult to force somebody to go to a different zip code or area of town if there simply wasn't an available residence there for them. I know property value is a concern. I am not an expert on that, and I'm not going to pretend to be. I looked a little bit today, and I think I found one study that people have been referencing that made a connection. I don't know much about it. I couldn't tell what the controls were, if the study controlled for other factors that might affect property values in certain areas of town. I also don't know if there's other studies validating that study or if it's just one study. So those would be questions to ask if that's something that you consider further. And then last, I think the real hard question is, if there is any kind of ordinance or legislative mechanism that might increase property values, maybe. So even if there was a scenario where offenders could be forced to live other places and the property value maybe increased a little, what would that do? Is that worth the risk that might be there for offenders not registering or being unstable and perhaps being at a higher risk to create new victims? So those are the tough questions that I don't know that I have all the answers for you, but you're charged with making. I really appreciate you hearing me out and what I have to say as you approach all those issues. Thank you.
I don't want to take up too much time because I know we're very limited in our time, but what we do in our agency is we supervise those offenders that are put on probation or come out of prison on parole or extended supervision. I have 4 agents dedicated in my office that supervise sex offenders exclusively. They have smaller caseloads, so they can spend more time with the individual sex offenders. They use a variety of tools, including GPS monitoring, electronic bracelets for curfew violations. They use alcohol monitoring devices if that is an issue, including sobriety or a bracelet called the TAD. So they're using a lot of issues. They see these individuals a lot more often. They see them at least every week. They see in their homes at least a minimum of 1 time a month. They're talking to collaterals, treatment professionals, family members, whoever they can, employers often, just to make sure that we're supervising the best we can. There is no cure-all. We cannot prevent things from happening, but we can do what we can to make sure they get into the right treatment programs, that they're supervised, know that we're watching. We use our community partners more than you can imagine, not just law enforcement, but we use neighbors. Notifications are very important because I probably get 1 or 2 calls a week from somebody in a neighborhood that says, hey, I know this person is living there and something doesn't feel right. We'll check into it to see if there's something going on. Sometimes it's nothing, sometimes there is something going on. But just so you know, we do the best that we can in our community. We supervise, those 4 agents supervise around 100, 110 sex offenders. It's not every sex offender in Oshkosh, but it's the ones that we feel are the highest risk. And we do what we can. We make sure they're in treatment and that they're complying with all the rules of supervision. And as you saw in your packets when you got the rules of supervision, there's a lot of different rules that they have to abide by. And that's about all I'll take.
Yes.
Look through.
Left click is forward.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I appreciate any chance to promote community safety. I am with Reach Counseling Services. We're in Neenah, Wisconsin. We're a state licensed mental health agency, and our focus is on sexual abuse issues. This is me. I'm the Sex Offender Treatment Program Director. Our agency's been around since 1975. We've been treating sex offenders since about 1980. I've been working exclusively with sex offenders for the past 15 years. This is the mission of our agency, to end sexual violence, promote healing in our community. So in other words, to make our communities healthier and safer places. These are our programs, which I'm not going to go into, but we do prevention, we do counseling, we do advocacy, we do crisis. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the sex offender treatment program. What we focus on is what works in sex offender treatment. And luckily, there's a large evidence base, large research base of practices that we know works for sex offender treatment. Sex offender treatment does reduce the risk of reoffense. There's also a broad research base that supports that. What we do in sex offender treatment is we work to reduce what's called some of the dynamic risk factors of offenders. Dynamic means that these risk factors are changeable, that they can be reduced with proper treatment. There are many, many dynamic risk factors. These are just a few. If an offender has no personal support system, nobody to go to when they're experiencing stress or problems, or if they suddenly lose their support system, that's a risk factor. If their primary support group consists of criminal associates, that's a risk factor. If they only have as support people who have active criminal thinking. Emotional suffering, negative emotionality, any negative feelings, depression, anger, hopelessness, any kind of negative emotionality is a risk factor. And lifestyle instability, so that could mean joblessness, homelessness, any of the above things also that I've talked about. So what does work? And again, evidence-based practices, or EBPs. This is the gold standard for policy and program development. And EBPs are simply what will yield the best results for enhancing community safety. When we talk about treatment, one size fits all sex offender treatment is not likely to be effective. It also interferes with successful integration into the community. The reason for that is because every sex offender is an individual. We can't treat them all the same. They all have different risk factors. They all have different preferred victim profiles. They all they're at all different risk levels. Some are high risk, some are low risk, some are medium risk. What we do, and what has been found to work based on evidence, is individualized treatment plans. So we focus on the individual's own risk factors. We separate the high and the low-risk offenders because research has found that if we put low-risk offenders with high-risk offenders, the low-risk offenders may actually get worse. That's important. We also enjoy a strong partnership with law enforcement and with the Department of Corrections. We count on them. We couldn't do things without them. Part of this is called the containment approach, and that means containing sex offenders or managing them in the community in the most efficient way possible. And we work with the DOC, we work with polygraph examiners. Polygraphs validate information that we receive in treatment, and all this helps to contain a sex offender in the safest way possible. Our treatment is victim-centered because we are always thinking about the victims, the effects on the victims, the healing for the victims. It goes right back to our mission. Promoting healing, and helping our communities to be safe. So sex offender treatment is also prevention because by successful treatment, risk of reoffense is reduced. So it acts as a treatment program and a prevention program. We talk about access to victims. That also needs to be tailored to each offender's risk and their offense patterns and their victim preferences. So we can use that same statement about one-size-fits-all sex offender treatment not being effective. We can use that same thing with one-size-fits-all residency requirements. That would also interfere with successful integration into the community. One difficulty with residency laws is it assumes that all sex offenders are at the same risk level, and that is simply not true. An incest offender with one victim has done a horrible thing, but that individual is not nearly as high risk as an individual who goes out into the community and targets young boys, for example. That particular offender is likely to have many more victims and is more likely to reoffend in the future. Also, residency restrictions by themselves cannot keep offenders from potentially high-risk areas, and again, we just don't know what those high-risk areas are for all offenders because they're all different. And Nicole has talked about some of these. A stranger assault is very rare. However, if there is a sexual predator out there and they are fixated on assaulting a child who is a stranger, that predator will go out and find a child to assault, regardless of where that predator lives. You may say, why make it easier? But for sex offenders, it does not have to be easier. Some of their dynamics are that they are often very methodical and patient. They often have a pipeline of victims. They may plan their victims for days, weeks, months, or even years. They may target a victim, and all their planning and the grooming that Nicole talked about is all part of their cycle. It's all part of their abusive cycle. So to a sex offender, easy doesn't matter. To a true predator. Residency rules, again, the myths based on all sex offenders reoffend, that treatment does not work, and that sex offenders are strangers to their victims. Residency restrictions can work against the focus of treatment and may actually increase some of those dynamic risk factors that I was talking about, the instability, the negative emotionality. Here's some of the negative factors that can result from residency restrictions. They can't live with supportive family members, and most offenders count on that when they are released from prison, living with a supportive family member. There can be financial issues if they're far from places where they can work. There is emotional suffering, often if they're made to live away from home. And like Nicole talked about, homelessness, and when an offender is homeless, it's hard to track them down to be on the registry. Best and worst scenarios with residency restrictions, they are popular because on the surface they do appear to protect children. At best, they don't have an effect on reoffending. And at the worst, they can create instability for sex offenders and incentives to commit new crimes. Think about mixing the low and the high risk offenders again, and think about some of those, what did you call it, the colonization of offenders, how they... Clustering, yes, the clustering of offenders. Think what would happen when low and high risk offenders cluster together. And there actually is no research-based evidence that residence restrictions reduce sexual or other reoffenses. This is a quote by the authors of this article that I would like to hand out. These people have done quite a lot of research on residence restrictions. Sex offenders need to feel that they're productive members of society, and then they can be less likely to reoffend. So there are options. And we encourage all policymakers to consider options that are most likely to achieve the goals of community safety, and at the same time minimize some of the collateral consequences to sex offenders and thereby community safety. So to promote our mission, again, we focus on what works best to protect and heal our community. There are options. One option is identifying child safety zones or loitering zones that can be monitored by GPS, and I believe that we do that currently in our state, that some zones are identified by agents.
Yes,
And
that's correct.
and that the offenders with the monitors are tracked to stay out of those areas. Now, this isn't a perfect system, but that can be a better way to monitor movements of a child molester rather than restricting a residence where an offender may simply eat and sleep. And we pledge our ongoing commitment to working toward community safety. We will continue to collaborate with our community partners in helping to manage sex offenders. Thank you very much.
Want to just click through. I know we're pushed for time. I just want to make some real brief comments that I think our primary role, and the only one that I really want to touch on with any amount of information, is informing the public about sex offender releases. We've done 5 of those notifications this year. It seems like probably more than that, but there's been 5. And we take that role very seriously. We work very good with our partners on the core team, and there's lots of factors that we consider when we make those notifications. But the primary roles of law enforcement: informing the community of the presence of sex offenders, verifying compliance with registration laws, locating non-compliant or absconded offenders, investigating violations of such laws and new sex offenses, responding to victims of sex crimes, and educating the community, which is what we're doing. The how, the whats, the who's get notified is all discussed by the core team. This is one example of a document we look at. We look at the risk assessments with all these things, whether a weapon was used, degree of force, the contact, age, vulnerability of the victims, and so on, to make a decision about how we notify. I will always, as a matter of personal philosophy, notify through the media, make a community notification. On the 5 notifications we've done this year, it also included door-to-door distribution of flyers, and at least one we've done a community meeting. We intend to probably step up our community meetings once we have the outreach vehicle at our disposal. As we're distributing flyers as appropriate, we intend to hold community meetings right there in the neighborhood and answer questions. The last slide, just very briefly, I'm not going to go over all these. This is what a good, effective sex offender management program looks like. I think we've hit every single one of those in our description today. We work very closely with our partners at REACH, the Department of Corrections, Todd's crew, with Nicole, and I think that speaks volumes on the best practices for sex offender management. And I think all of those we take a very proactive stance on. So with any remaining time, if we have
I
questions.
appreciate it. Anybody, a couple people have a dying question?
A dying question, since Gordon's here. Anything pending in the legislature, upcoming, anything that's going to strengthen this, strengthen the local communities, anything?
Not that I'm aware of. I seen it years ago when you really had more of the local ordinances going on, but at the state level, no.
Well, I'll be just brief. I was the one that brought it forward. We had several citizens concerned about the last placement, and where we didn't have an ordinance or anything, I thought I'd bring the discussion forward. Chief and I talked about it. I agree. I don't think it works. So I think this is the best approach. But I want everybody to hear that.
I guess I'm going to have to bring this to the end. It's almost 10:02. I do thank the folks for being here, Mary Catherine, and Nicole, and Todd, and Chief Gould. Thank you. Very well organized, some good information here. It's nice to have you here so we can see you face to face. I assume if people have questions that they can contact you individually, whichever would be the most pertinent, so that won't be an issue. I guess we'll bring it to her again. I'll thank everybody for being here. The information was useful, well organized. We'll see where we go from there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.